All right, because whoa. So I haven't got any direction, but I think we'll just go ahead and get started. My name is Ed Field. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Cytomedix, and I'm also the Chair of the Capital Formation Committee of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and have the privilege of being able to moderate this panel about financing. We've got a great panel today, and I don't want to take too much time, but I thought I'd just kind of give an introduction to the panel before we get started. I think 2013 certainly has been a very interesting year from a financing perspective. I think the obvious boom in terms of IPOs has been quite remarkable. And in fact, many of the regenerative medicine companies have actually gone through the window, like Bluebird, Cellular Dynamics, and Fate Therapeutics, which is great news for the space. In addition, there have been a number of public companies that have been able to finance, and recently deals by Neostem, Stem Cells Inc., and FiberCell show that the public companies are able to get financed. And then I did see a statistic here recently that on the private side, that $1.3 billion was raised in the second quarter of this year for private biotech financings, which is one of the highest numbers of any quarter in recent history, and about 40% of that were in new deals. So obviously that's a great trend. Unfortunately, it follows the first quarter, which was the lowest quarter in 19 years. So, I'm not sure what to make of it all, but we've got a great panel to kind of sort out the issues. And I do want to make it interactive, so we'll have time at the end to ask questions of our panelists. So just to introduce the panelists, we've got Carl Handelsman, who's the founder of Codon Capital. We have Ted Roth, who's the president of Roth Capital. Jonathan Cope, who's the managing member of Lincoln Park Capital. And Mark Sod, who's the CFO of Therapies. And so what I thought we would do, just to get the panel going, is kind of work through the financing continuum from private to public to alternative structures, and then a viewpoint from a company's perspective. So we're going to start here with Carl and basically ask Carl to go through his background and talk about trends he sees in the VC or the early stage financing, some of the trends that are going on there, as well as some of his experiences in regenerative medicine space. So, thanks, Carl.
So first, starting off with my trajectory, I started off as an academic researcher working in a lab where the second postdoc from that lab actually just won a Nobel Prize, and then moved to business development in small companies, biotech companies, Tularic and Millennium, both of which were later bought for billions of dollars. And I've spent more than 14 years as a venture capitalist, investing primarily in early-stage biotech. But since it's been over 14 years, some of those investments lasted to later stages. And the most important thing as an entrepreneur is to have a financing path, because there's nothing more dilutive than running out of money. So my last fund that I just left was a large fund. It was $400 million. And I decided to leave as a managing director, leave that, and found Codon Capital because I've had the observation that it's a great time to get involved with extremely early stage companies, form them, and get them faster, better, higher quality assets in terms of how the companies are built. And that wasn't really possible before. And just parenthetically, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, pharma companies weren't as open to partnering or in-licensing or external projects, and now they get more than half their pipeline externally. And the good news about that is that they're very open to having discussions at an early stage and telling you what they like and what they don't like. So some of the trends next I'll switch to some of the trends I see in venture financing. A lot of it's project-based financing, developing an asset with clinical data so that it can get acquired. In some cases, it's stranded assets, where the asset with some more clinical data and more investment can be made useful. But there's also still some big, new, bold companies that are being formed, and I think the big examples of that are venture companies like Third Rock or Flagship. So specifically on regenerative medicine, I think the big thing and this came up this morning, the big problem always is manufacturing. Like how's that going to layer on top of the cost? And will that actually drive so much of the cost that you're not going to be able to create enough value that it's a big win both for the patients and for the healthcare systems. The other thing is it's a new modality, and because of that, although I'm really excited about this panel that's happening tomorrow with the pharma partners, it's a new modality, and because of that, it's harder to get pharma companies to step in and help with the financing of and the development of those programs. So that's the end of my. I'm looking at two companies right now. One is a conjunction with this course that I'm teaching with Steve Blank around the therapeutic applications of the lean launch process. He's the guru of that, and that's in a CNS area. And the other one I'm looking at is modifying a cell to give it new properties, but it still would be a regenerative cell-based therapy.
Right. And maybe a quick question there, Carl. When you look at these technologies at early stage, are there certain types of technologies you're looking at, like allogeneic versus autologous, or disease areas that you think are more applicable, or are there any filters you're using at that early stage?
The filters for everything early stage is what can you demonstrate on the first 18 months that creates more value than what you put into it. You really got to ask yourself, if you can't find people that will care, why are you doing it?
Okay. So let's move on to Ted to talk about the next step in the continuum, which would be the public markets. Ted.
Thanks, Ed. As I'm sure most of you know, and as Ed referred to previously, the IPO market has been extremely robust this year. I'll give you, if you'll bear with me, I'll give you a few numbers and statistics as to how good it's been. During 2013, year to date, there have been about 170 IPOs raising $41 billion, which is an average of about $240 million per transaction. Of those 170, there have been 42 that are healthcare, and that has raised about $8.6 billion, with an average of about 205. Now, it's interesting that the largest one of the healthcare, as it's captured in the source that I used, is a veterinarian medicine supply that was about a $3.5 billion raise. So if I take that one out and three of the other so taking out the top four healthcare transactions results in about 38 IPOs raising $3 billion, or what you would normally expect an average of right around $80 million per transaction. And of the 38 healthcare IPOs, 33 were in the pharma biotech space. Or when I say pharma, I'm talking more drug development and the biotech, where they raised almost $3 billion. And if you want to even slice it a little farther, if you look at the number of IPOs raising less than $100 million, which is typical for companies that are at the development stage, there were 30 in healthcare raising $1.8 billion, which is an average of about $60 million per transaction. If we then look at some of the regenerative medicine IPOs, there were three that I would kind of highlight. One is stem line therapeutics, which maybe is not directly regenerative medicine, but it does serve in the area kind of attacking the cancer cells. What's interesting about this is that it was done in January of 2013, raising $33 million. Not enough for what they were looking for. There was a subsequent raise then that I'll talk to a little bit later. But this is a structure that we're seeing more and more of in the smaller market cap and the smaller raise on the IPOs. One in June that I'm sure a lot of you know about is Bluebird Bio. They raised $100 million, had the bulge bracket firms in there. Stock has done very well. It came at $17 a share, and now over $22, and has really been a kind of a bellwether, if you will, in the regenerative medicine space. And then one that was just recently done in the last 2 weeks, Fate Therapeutics, a company here in San Diego that was done at $6. It was down from the original filing price, but they did get the transaction done, and it has performed well in the aftermarket. some of the reasons that the IPO market has been strong. I think everybody would point to the Jobs Act as being one that has helped. It has allowed the companies to feel more confident that the transaction was going to get done, or that you weren't going to be in a situation where you filed, you ran into a difficult market, and through no fault of your own, you ended up not being able to go public, and then you have to live with that stigma. With a confidential filing capability under the Jobs Act, really gives you the confidence that if you do hit the market at a bad time, you just don't go on the roadshow. Now, granted, you spent the money to go forward, but at least you can kind of call your shots when you want to hit the market. And of course, the recovering economy has helped, and the stock market being up, a lot of funds they have more money not only from the inflow, but also from the money that they've made. They need to reinvest it and are always looking for other opportunities. The follow-on market for public companies has also been strong this year. There have been over 900 transactions year to date, raising $45 billion in follow-ons. The biotech pharma space was a little over 200 transactions with about $5 billion being raised there, an average around $40 million per transaction. So Ed also asked that talk a little bit about what we have done, who Roth Capital is, and what we have done. We are a full-service investment bank that a lot of people say that's what you are, but then the next thing is, what does that mean? We make a market in stocks, in publicly traded stocks, provide analytical research, distribution to institutional investors. We do not have a retail component. All of the accounts that we deal with are the mutual funds, hedge funds, larger family offices, etc. And we also primarily manage liquidity events, whether it's a capital raise or a sale and acquisition. The sectors that we cover are life science, technology, the semiconductors and software, consumer, media, clean tech, primarily companies with market caps around the $500 million. If our real sweet spot is about $250 to $750 million, and we have the resources to help them both with, as I said, in the market making and also in providing research, doing non-deal roadshows, conferences, everything that we can to bring them together with the institutional investor. If you look at, as I said, we have several sectors in there. It's sometimes easier to describe by the research analysts that we have. And in healthcare, we currently have 4 senior reporting analysts in the medical device space, one in spec pharma or generics, one in pharmaceutical developments, and biotech. And the biotech analyst is Joe Panginas, who some of you may know. Joe covers about 30 companies, and 4 of which are regenerative medicine. He currently covers Astrum, Cytori, Stemline Therapeutics, and Veristem. If we look at the offerings that Roth has done so far year to date, including IPOs and follow-ons, we have completed about 70 transactions, raising over $2 billion. And our healthcare offerings, which includes medical device and the spec pharma and all those, about a little over 30 offerings where we've raised $1.2 billion. Most of these have been shelf registration statements, companies that have filed a shelf and are taking down from that. Some of them are confidentially marketed, others are fully marketed, and most of them have been underwritten. I want to just briefly talk about 4 that we have done this year in the stem cell area. One was in March of this year. We raised about $3 million for a Canadian company, a Toronto-based Stem Cell Therapeutics. It was a $3 million raise. It was a common stock and warrants. It's a company that's in phase 1. Their product is currently in phase 1 testing. In May of this year, we did a $70 million transaction for Stemline Therapeutics. That's the one that I talked about previously that did the IPO, raising $33 million. They priced that at $10 in January, and in May they did a follow-on offering where they raised the $70 million. Stock price had gone from $10 to $14.50, and it's now at $37. So they went from about a $100 million market cap to currently about 450, a little over 450 million. Another one that we did, International Stem Cell Corporation, that we raised $3 million. It was also a common plus a warrant. This is a company that has less than a $30 million market cap, have $5 million in revenues, losing money, but we were able to get that done with institutional investors. We also did one in July with Veristem, where we raised $65 million. Stock at the time in July, it's about a $300 million market cap company. The stock was at 11.25. It's currently trading at 15. And finally, in August, we did a $4 million raise for Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics. It was also a common plus warrant, and the transaction came at 17 cents, and the stock is currently trading at 19 cents. So as you can kind of see, it's all over the board. It's the smaller ones that we're able to structure some transactions with, typically with warrants, and then the larger ones that have had more exposure to the institutional investor base, where they are willing to, where they are looking for investments like this, but they certainly want the liquidity and the knowledge that the company is going to be on its way to commercialization.
Great, thanks, Ted. It's nice to see you so busy, right?
Yeah.
Good to see that. So maybe we'll move on to Jonathan. Jonathan, again, with Lincoln Park Capital, involved a lot in the public markets with some unique structures. Maybe it's a great follow-on from Ted's comments.
Sure. Thanks, Ed. And just want to thank the Alliance for what's, I think, so far been a very informative conference. So Lincoln Park Capital is a fund based in Chicago. We have really two lines to our business. We invest in private equities. And on the private equity side, we tend to get involved with companies at a fairly early stage, usually kind of around a Series A or even before that in terms of our investments. We, to date, have invested in IT, in media, and in some financial services. We've not invested in health sciences, and I can talk about that in a little bit. On the public side, the public equities, we have been fairly active in the health sciences arena. And we'll look at diagnostic opportunities, medical device, platform technologies, and biotech. And I'm actually joined today at the conference with a colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Bobert, who heads up our SAB and allows us to do a deeper dive when we need to in some of the life sciences opportunities that we invest in. We will participate on the public side in deals such as those that Ted just mentioned, in follow-on offerings, confidentially marketed offerings, takedowns off of a shelf, private placements, and we'll also make commitments to fund companies over time. And these are transactions where a company has the ability to sell stock to us, typically over a 2 or 3 year period of time at their discretion. These are transactions that are just common stock, so we're just buying a very simple equity-based transaction. Fundamentally, we do not short or hedge, so we are a long-only based institution. I thought for a couple minutes I would share just a little bit more data. I think some of the data that Ted just provided is very useful. But I thought I would just add a little bit in terms of what we've seen over the last couple of years. And we, as a measurement period, we wanted to look back October of 2011 through September of 2012, and then look at the corresponding period, October of 2012 through September of 2013, and just see what the data looked like for some of these transactions, the registered direct deals, the confidentially marketed public offerings that Ted talked about. And again, these are public companies that have a shelf registration statement and are selling equity off of the shelf, and then the deals get flipped to the public and are done for some specific exchange reasons, as well as some of the data on ATMs at the market and equity line transactions, and then also some things we've seen on the debt side of the ledger as well. So interestingly, the companies we looked at were biotech companies, not regenerative medicine per se, but certainly included in that subset that we looked at. The average market cap of these companies was about $140 million, to give you a sense of the size. So over the period from beginning a couple of years ago, we saw about 125 placements, 125 transactions for an aggregate of about $2.5 billion transacted, with a median size transaction of just over $11 million. In the more recent period, in the 2012 through the present day, the number of transactions increased. It was closer to about 150. We saw about $3.2 billion total transacted, and a median size of the transactions also increased to closer to $15 million. So I think that trend in and of itself is rather positive for companies that are out there now in the sector in terms of an increase in the dollars raised of about 28%, and the median size of these transactions increasing about 30% year over year. A breakdown of these transactions, to give you a little bit more flavor for what we saw, in the period 2 years ago, about 60% of these transactions were these registered direct or confidentially marketed offerings, and about 42% were actual private placements where the companies just sold stock, and that stock was subsequently registered. And it was actually comparable in the more recent period, about 53% registered directs or confidentially marketed deals, and about 47% private placements. Of this basket of deals that we looked at, a small number, about 18%, were structured as convertible preferred or convertible debt deals in both periods. I think interestingly, in terms of sometimes people talk about the discount to market in these deals, and they want to know the trends on that side of the ledger. So 2 years ago, we saw sort of an average discount to market of about 15%, and in the more recent period, we saw that decrease to closer to 10%. So better terms for the companies. About 40% of the transactions that we measured in both periods had warrant coverage in the deal, and the amount of warrant coverage where warrant coverage was offered actually has improved from a company perspective, not necessarily an investor perspective, but it's decreased from about 2/3 warrant coverage a couple of years ago to closer to 50% warrant coverage more recently. These commitment transactions that I mentioned, the ATMs and these ELC transactions, about 1/3 of the transactions that we measured in both periods were actually either an ATM or an ELC. So I think it's become more common for biotech companies, publicly traded biotech companies, to put in place some type of funding mechanism like an ATM or an ELC. Interestingly, I mentioned debt transactions, and I thought I'd just comment quickly on that. We have seen an uptick in debt transactions for smaller biotech companies as well. And this is a little counterintuitive for companies that don't have a balance sheet that would traditionally support a pure debt transaction. You think of these typically as asset-based, or maybe there's a real income statement that can support the amortization of the loan. And yet we are seeing these with pharma and with biotech companies. There's a number of players out there that will provide debt financing. Usually these deals are about a 3-year amortization period. The coupon on these deals tends to be around a range of about 9 to 13%. I think the coupon's been improving for companies over the last 2 years. And typically these providers, these lenders, will also look for a bit of warrant coverage as a sweetener for the transaction. But I think it's illustrative, these debt transactions, of just how much more robust the public markets are. Ultimately, I think these lenders have a firm level of confidence that the companies will, if need to, go back to the equity markets and raise capital and be able to service the debt from these equity offerings, as opposed to ultimately having to take the keys to the business. So just to quickly summarize, I think the data that we've looked at over the 2-year period, I think is quite positive for certainly on the public side and for some of these transactions beyond the IPO stage. From a company perspective, I think the markets are more robust. I think deal terms are getting better and better for the companies. I think the pace is quickening for the number of transactions that we're seeing. And frankly, I think companies wisely are taking advantage of this window while it's open.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, Mark, supposedly it's great out there. So what's your experience been?
Yeah, jump in. Water's warm.
Yeah.
Cytori is based right here in San Diego. We're a publicly held regenerative medicine company. Our technology is based on adult stem and regenerative cells from our own body fat. And that was convincingly shown by a lot of our core original team back at UCLA a little over a decade ago. And we've since, as a company, really since 2002, have been dedicated towards understanding the science behind adult stem and regenerative cells that come from fat tissue, and then exploring how to bring those forward clinically, and then also developing a commercial vehicle. And in our case, because of the differences in yield of cells that you get from fat tissue in contrast with other cell sources, particularly bone marrow or others, we were able to go a different route than the conventional approach of cell culture. We actually have a real-time fresh model. We think that difference is a good thing, having a point-of-care device that can be affordable at the point of care right in a clinic or a hospital for a patient to get their very own cells in about an hour. And then exploring the therapeutic uses of those has been a big part of what we've done over the past, I'd say, the most recent phase of the company, certainly over the last 5 years. And so a lot of exciting potential. Our end game, we believe, is to help millions and millions of people around the world, and along the way, create a very large company. And we think the 10-plus year, $350 million investment that we've really embarked upon, and we believe are at a fairly advanced point, should pay off. Of course, that's why we're here. Being on this panel, I think perhaps we're here in part because as a small company, that $350 million did not come easily or through 1 or 2 deals. I just before we came in here, I did a quick inventory, and I believe it was certainly north of 20 transactions. And I've been with the company since 2004, so coming up on 10 years. And I can personally account for probably 15 or 16, which run the gamut of true private placements, corporate investments, for which we've been fortunate to have had, I believe, 5 or 6 of. Typical registered deals, the likes of which have been described on the panel. I think we've done 6 of those. We were just talking about debt transactions, 3 of those. I got 3 of those. Some licensed transactions, divestitures. We'll knock over a 7-Eleven. We'll do a bake sale. We'll do it. So there is that element of things. And so I hope I can be constructive for the group to the extent that I'm sure we have audience members from different phases of companies, some late, some more early. I think I've seen good markets where there is a greater receptivity amongst the investors who truly take an interest in companies and fund them. I think it's a really important point because I think even today, relative to certainly 10 years ago and before, I don't think the fundamental investor universe is the same anywhere near which it used to be. And as a result, the types of transactions you see and the stickiness for which those investors actually continue their investment is very limited relative to what it used to be. But we have seen many things both in good markets and not so good markets. I would just kind of hyper-simplify it to say probably our first $100 million back in the early days came very serendipitously. And if not for that, a very new platform would have never been born because it was too different, too risky. No one would have given it a chance. The next $100 million really came from some fortunate timing with some strategic partners. And that was very advantageous. And so you're trying to create a company where the value goes up and you're demonstrating that value to the shareholders, even though you're in a sector that's fundamentally early stage. But we were successful in that. And I probably characterize the last $100 million as just a pure street fight with a lot of small deals, trying to minimize toxicities in your capital structure and trying to get to those pivot points where the real fundamental investors who really aren't out there to the same degree will take notice. And one of the stats that really alarmed me was back in 2000, and granted that was a fairly euphoric time, you had about 10,000 publicly traded companies on New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and Amex. And even with the recent increased activity out there, I still think we're less than 5,000. So if you process that for a minute, that's a very different dynamic of public companies. And the stratification of that has changed too. I mean, you don't have the same ecosystem for small and microcap today that you did 15 years ago, both on the investor side, on the analyst side, on media, you name it, it's different. And so it's certainly polarized to the larger cap. Post-Lehman, post-mortgage scandals, you name it, I think the world has certainly gone more risk averse. So what that means is the bar is raised, and irrespective of the fact that transactions can get done, because they certainly can, the quality of the transactions, how the company is left after the transactions, it's a really important part that needs to be included in the equation. And I think if your environment is such that it's a fairly risk-averse environment, valuations are low. For not all, there's an exception to every rule, and some good companies were mentioned. By and large, groups in our peer group are at lower market caps today. And I think that's reflective of just a more risk-averse landscape relative to clinical stage for biotech companies. And so getting to those clinical points, particularly, or partnership points where your remaining fundamental investors will really buy and hold is a vital progress point to make. And so we're certainly, as one company, trying to make that transition as fast as we can. We know our peer companies are racing to get to there as well. But I could certainly chat about a lot of the structures that we've employed. Some have worked out better than others. Some structures I've done twice, worked out great one time, not great the next time. So I think we've seen a lot, and we're hoping we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and hoping it's not a train coming our direction, but we're feeling like we're getting there. But just happy to be on the panel and hopefully provide anything of value.
Right. So I'm going to start off with a question. I think we've heard a lot of numbers. We've heard big numbers. That includes the biotech space. That's small molecules, antibodies, more traditional biotech products. Can you talk about the unique challenges of selling a regenerative medicine investment opportunity? What are the real questions that are out there? How do you overcome them? What do you see the most? Because I think we all know that this space is a little bit different than the more traditional biotechs. But what do you hear? And how do you overcome this?
It's not unlike 20 years ago when we were talking about recombinant proteins. It's something that and at that time, the institutional investor base was not nearly as sophisticated and as informed as they are now. It used to be. I mean, I remember when I was on the company side that when you'd go to Wall Street, you would inevitably meet with 3 MBA people. Now you go there and you got a PhD and an MD and a statistician. So the investor base is much more informed now than they were 20 years ago, but a lot of it is still the same question. And that question is, how can you convince me that this is not a science project and that it has commercial value or commercial potential? So that's really what, the stem cell, the promise, the expectations are huge. That's part of the reason that the California voters were willing to essentially tax themselves to create a mechanism for funding this at the early stage. So the real problem is just in the real difficulty in getting real institutional fundamental investors in is to show them that there is a path towards commercialization that they could follow both from a regulatory and also from a clinical standpoint.
But I think that one of the key things, and that's a perfect example, one of the first recombinant proteins that was made was insulin. And it was made in coli. And it has multiple disulfide bonds. So people out there are scientists will go, oh yeah, that was hard. And in reality, licensing and partnering with a big pharma to solve that manufacturing problem allowed them to put in the resources. The manufacturing people that figured out how to make recombinant insulin from E. coli are literally the unsung heroes. And I think there's similar things also with monoclonal antibody production, right? And even pharma, I'm not sure that they can afford to invest the same way and do the same type of partnerships. So that's one. I think that's a really big sort of thing that's different here that we have to think deeply about. And so some of the new exciting areas that I'm looking at sort of sidestep that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. At one of the first panel of the day, I think someone stood up and asked a question or made a point about sort of autologous stem cells not really being stem cells, and that led to some question. But I think it illustrates that even to this day, there's some uncertainty about what the mechanism of action is within some of the different technologies that are being presented today, and certainly, from an investor perspective, trying to understand what the mechanism of action is, or having someone explain what the mechanism of action is at least somewhat comforting, right? In areas of small molecule, in pharma, and other areas, I think the science can be simplified a little bit so that investors can get a better handle on what's going on. And so, just as a matter of fundamental due diligence, when there are questions about why does this really work? I mean, we're seeing a signal, but why are we seeing that signal? I think that kind of raises some important questions from an investor perspective. I think, as just alluded to, the commercialization ultimately, how do you get these things out to market seems to be a lot trickier in many instances than in other therapies, in other technologies, and maybe one example of a therapy that people got very excited about, and then obviously came back down to earth a little bit, was Provenge in the immunotherapy space, but it really kind of underscored the importance of giving a lot of forethought to manufacturing and to scale and cost of goods, and how you really kind of manage that process. And there's not a tremendous amount of precedent out there for investors to look at, to point to understand. So I think that creates a certain level of uncertainty and complexity when trying to invest in regenerative medicine.
Sure. So in a world where today you're probably supposed to be virtual, focused, domestic, and don't think, certainly don't go anywhere near capital equipment, we've pretty much violated each and every one of those core principles. And so that certainly has made the degree of difficulty for our little company a lot greater. And then compounding the fact that we're very international. We've got about 115 people, 17 are in Japan. So we have a very different profile from what I think most people are comfortable seeing. And I think that difference, what do you do to the different kid in the sandbox? You beat him up. That's the first thing you do. But so we're trying to be that little kid that rises up. But obviously being different has its advantages, but it has its disadvantages. And so appreciating kind of the transition of things, you certainly have an active private community. And as an example of one company of which we probably have several peers, we're a little too far along to be really interesting to them. Our valuation relative to the private world's a little high. Maybe our stage is a little further along. So we really don't fit them. And then as you get to the public markets, and we talk about these transactions, I think being so international as we are, and given that the FDA has clearly gone the route of a little more risk-averse approach, I think I'm saying that politically correctly, is that the international areas is where we've seen most of our heretofore clinical and commercial experience. We're commercial stage in Europe. We're commercial stage in Japan, in places like that. So we have data. We probably have clinical experience of 5,000 to 6,000 patients being treated with their own stem cells and regenerative cells with our technology. It doesn't translate to the U.S. So when we go to a U.S. investor, it's, okay, that's great, that's cute, guys. What have you done here? Where's your U.S. trial that shows, in a rigorous way that this works? And if you look very critically and forensically at the field, you see very, very little U.S. data, certainly data that's truly prospective and double-blind and controlled. Well, that's what I think the bigger category of fundamental investors here in the States is truly looking for, to be able to validate, yes, this is not witchcraft, this is something that's more serious. So we're, as an example, we are getting, we think, dangerously close to delivering that and being hopefully a category leader in this field. But it's not without its frustration, though, because we feel like we have proven it over and over again, but yet when you look across the table and it's not really being appreciated until it gets here to the U.S. And the U.S. is certainly an environment where things aren't developing quite as quickly. So that introduces more time. An extra 3 years of development to us is an extra, depending on the year, $80 to $100 million. So that's a lot of money you have to raise and a lot of waters you have to navigate. So I think that's one of the things I'd point out. Now, on the flip side, where we have found, I think, some opportunity, and I think it cuts both ways on the federal and the state level. On the federal level, I think we've done fairly well. We were able to win a competitive contract for bioterrorism countermeasure. So with the BARDA organization, we won a nice contract to develop our technology towards treating radiation injury-related thermal burns. And we were awarded that last year. We've had specific objectives we have to do, and we've stated publicly we think we're within 6 months, knock on wood, of hitting those objectives. And that could open up a much larger pool of capital from the federal government. At the state level, we have not done as well. It was mentioned that the CIRM organization is here, which is great. And I think Jonathan actually mentioned something really telling, which is I think because we're autologous, fresh cells doesn't fit the profile of what they're looking for, unfortunately. But we still think we'd be a great opportunity for them to post a near-term win. So we've continually tried to reach out there. But that's an example where I think on the government level, in some cases we'll do well, and in some cases not, and we're seeing that around the world as well. So I think we have to find, I think being open to looking not where it's the most obvious, and that's not an inexpensive proposition. But I think if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't be here. And I think finding these avenues that are a little less appreciated, but that sort of just constant ingenuity and being comfortable, getting comfortable being uncomfortable is kind of just the nature of the beast.
Great. So we have about 20 minutes left for the panel session. I want to allow Q&A time. So what I've asked the panel to do, before we go to Q&A, maybe to stimulate questions, is to put forth a bold prediction. What will happen related to the financing environment in our space over the next 2 to 3 years? And hopefully that will stimulate, I would hope, a couple questions. So, Carl, why don't you lead us off?
I think some of the best performing companies in this space are going to be starting now from scratch.
So I went to my expert, to Joe Panginis, and I said, Joe, where do you think the breakthrough is going to come? And he believes it's going to be in the orthopedic side. He thinks that is probably the clearest path towards commercialization that will show that the technology works, and that's where he would look for the breakthroughs in the next few years.
It's interesting. I think if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you actually will now see some embryonic stem cell trials in process, and I think we might see some interesting data on that side of the ledger that is going to do a lot to I think propel all of the companies in the space potentially in the next 24 months.
I think that's right. I think if as a group we can produce clinical data, U.S. clinical data, then which heretofore I don't think there's been a lot of, and so if we can, as a group of companies, produce some U.S. clinical data, I remain optimistic that would move the needle.
So no one said that the IPO market's going to stay open for another 12 months? I mean, maybe a comment on that. I mean, are the public markets going to be as robust as we've seen over the last 12 months? Do you think that's going to stay? Is that...
I believe so. I think, obviously there are things that can come up, like we could have a government shutdown for 5 days or 6 days or whatever we're into now, and 6 months ago, if you'd have said the government shuts down, the market goes to hell, well, that hasn't happened. We've had other things come up. It used to be every morning you'd look at what happened in Greece the day before. So there are all of these other issues that could come up. But I think generally there's a lot of money out there. There's a lot of, there's increasingly more opportunities for that. And like Mark said, the number of public companies in particular has continued to go down. Even, yes, we are creating more in the IPO market, but there's also a balance in the M&A market where a lot of these companies are being acquired, particularly Big Pharma has had to really look to the smaller companies for their R&D, which they're not doing as much themselves. So I believe that everything else being relatively equal, that the markets both on the IPO and the follow-on public side are going to continue to be robust and receptive to new developments.
Right. All right, so we want to open it up. If anyone has questions for the panelists, we can take them now.
My name is Jill Helms. I'm from a company called Stanford University. So I'm in academics, and so I'm very interested in getting some advice. We're early stage, really early. That is, we're not a company, and we're in the area of orthopedics. So I'm trying to think about,
funded.
I know. So and we're going to use embryonic stem cells in a clinical trial. No.
You got it made.
And my question is this: give me some advice at this very early stage where we should be thinking about financing, that you can tell me, since we're at this, before any company has formed.
So, well, but what I'm going to say, half the people in here are doing it, which is, if you build a strong quality business case, you can always raise money, and you need to build that in before you have to have that operational plan from the very first day. And the mistake that too many of us have made in the past is setting those milestones internally and what scientifically is the smart thing to do, rather than finding out what the criteria are of the organizations. I go to Spark, I'm involved with Stanford, and there's a lot of great stuff going on there. But look at how many drugs have come out of Stanford compared to the least productive pharma company. So what are their criteria of what they would want to see that you're doing something, creating something of value, rather than just meeting some dumb venture capitalist milestone that I agreed because I was arm wrestling with you? It doesn't matter what we think. It matters what the external people think.
At the risk of being controversial, I'm going to disagree very strongly with seat number 2. And that is that you.
The one without the hair? Or
the one without the hair. Bald guy.
I prefer aerodynamic.
Yes. Your prediction was that the company that we all want to invest in is being formed right now today. And I strongly disagree, basically for one reason. Building a company and figuring out the bare essentials of something like one of these regenerative medicine companies is a long haul. It's a very complicated problem, and it's like HIV that first everybody thought was insoluble, and then suddenly somebody makes a breakthrough, and now you forget about the hundreds of other people who were going down different pathways. And I was very glad to hear you share your street fighting stories. I'm a black belt myself, and it is a street fight, and I think the companies that are going to go to the forefront are the companies that have been in it, struggling, trying to figure out what to do, what not to do. That's
Please don't hurt me.
I think, maybe to put, Carl, is the point you're making that the technologies that you think are valuable are these next generation ones because we've learned so much from the earlier experiences? Is that your point? Or?
Maybe I could give an example of something that's here now, but also, precision genome engineering, right? Sangamo's doing some very exciting work in that area, but now there's CRISPR technology. And starting from scratch, you can do things. You can build an operational plan that I believe creates value in 18 months. And I know what you're saying. I was one of the first employees at Tularik, and the idea there was we'd get 10 of the smartest people in the field, plus me, and $10 million, and we'd figure it out. And we cannot afford to do that now. We have to have the operational plan from day one. We have to talk to all the external pharma, the key opinion leaders, and understand what is the key data we're trying to produce preclinically, clinically, that actually creates real value rather than just sort of moves us along.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
But we can go, so let me give you another example. There's the ability to deliver in a targeted way nucleic acids, not like a liposome gets to the liver, but something really where you can do that. There's a company within walking distance of here that I think is going to crack that.
Are these all the companies that you've invested in?
These are the companies I have not invested in these companies yet, but this is why I did this, what most people regard as a stupid thing of leaving this bigger fund to go and work on these little things. I think you can do better, faster, cheaper with these little things. But
You guys need to talk, I think, right? Yeah. Martin.
Carl, what is your investment horizon when you talk about building value cheaper, quicker, etc.? Because many of us in this room have been at building sustainable business enterprises using very, very novel technology platforms for 10, 12, 15 years. So, it's pays your money, make your choice. There's different investment theses and so on. So it might be useful if you could put into perspective, your investment philosophy relative to your investment horizon.
So my philosophy is based on things that I've been involved with that I've actually been able to execute, and it's not going to work for everything. But I'm working with Steve Blank, the guru of lean launch, which has been always applied to IT, to apply that to therapeutics. And to sort of steal one of his lines, I think, the 5-year plan, that didn't work out that well with the Soviet Union. And so I'm not saying that you should be able to get a drug approved in 18 months. That's impossible. But you need to have an operational plan where you can take something, this early stage stuff, it's pre-competitive. Pharma, if it comes out of academics, pharma doesn't believe it's even true. So you've got to turn it into a bite-sized piece of innovation with criteria that they value. And I think that's what's different. And then you talked about virtual. You're outsourcing I don't believe in totally virtual, but you're outsourcing creation of your core value. When you do that, you better know who you're outsourcing it to and why they're the best group in the world and why they can do it better than everyone else. And are they the one that all the smartest people would outsource it to? Put another way, if Tularik wasn't acquired and was still around, we would still be doing the fight too. But if you were to start over today, you wouldn't do it the way that, right? The first $100 million that you talked about, you wouldn't spend it that way.
Yeah, retrospectively, you can always spend money differently, but it's finding that most accurate path to an end game, whatever that end game may be, is prospectively hard to do when you're not following someone else's path, when you're doing something truly novel. So I've gone through that exercise. I've done that 3 in the morning exercise. Man, if we didn't hire that CRO back in 2006, we would have had $800,000 more, and that would have done. I've done that, but I don't know. You can add up those numbers and get there. And I think the thing I would caution against is, you are going to have times when it may not seem easy at the time, but when you have enough time frame to have a real base of experience to see it the next time, you could recognize, hey, we're in a really good phase now. And maybe some companies, maybe Veristem and Bluebird are perfect examples of that. And then the trap is to really open up the hiring spigots. And you start going after more things, and you reach wider and broader. And those are the things that I feel like come back to bite you if at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, it's where do you really stand in terms of your investable profile? What's the substantive element, either to the partner or to the true fundamental investors? And if it's really phase 1 data that's being well marketed, well then, unless there's something that's going to really capture that and bring it to the next level, there in many cases will be a fall. And is your organization set up in a way that you can compress enough so that you can sustain till the next good time? Now that might be more of a public company way of thinking, but that's the only nuance I would add to that.
I think Carl, though, I'm sorry,
Go
just
ahead.
quickly just to add on to this. I think you really have raised a very provocative question or issue, which is certainly outside of biotechnology or life sciences. I think in IT, I mentioned that we do some private company investing, right? You mentioned the lean launch. What it historically took millions of dollars potentially to get a company off the ground in the IT space really can be done now for hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And it's been transformative. And you see networks of angel investors across the country and some earlier stage VC-focused companies that are able to make multiple bets on IT companies and other technology companies and really be able to defend those investments, knowing that it's not going to require the same aggregate dollars to get these businesses off the ground. You have to believe in the idea. You certainly have the risk of being leapfrogged in a potentially much shorter window now. But some of these things I think have been really quite transformative. The question, though, I think, and why I think this is really provocative, is getting back to life sciences, whether it's regenerative medicine or other applications. And I think that maybe the point that some folks were making is that you still face the regulatory pathway, at least in the U.S., that you have to go through. There's been a lot of discussion about reimbursement and how that plays out and how that's regulated and what that's going to look like in different areas. And so how you really can kind of apply some of these transformative things that we see in other sectors back to the life sciences from a startup perspective or early stage company, I think it's a very, very interesting topic, and certainly you've got some paradigms where you've seen something. I think that really is very, very useful to communicate to some of the companies that are here.
Oh, 3 minutes?
My voice is extremely loud, so it's okay. I'm Steve Chang. I'm from the New York Stem Cell Foundation and Research Institute. So I actually was in a field that I think saw resurgence. And I sometimes wonder, that's the area of gene therapy.
Yeah.
And right, so Carl knows and Ted knows that Biogene was a company that went public in the early 90s that I was associated with. And that field disappeared. But all of a sudden the field reappeared. Bluebird Bio, I saw data today. Molecular Med. We started another company called Kanji, which Sherry bought. But that field has come back. So I'm wondering, I'm asking the panel here, do you think stem cells has a way? I think people like Marty, Stem Cells Inc., those guys were pioneers, Cytomedix pioneers in this field, right? And they're just surviving. And the fact that they can survive, the field will sustain itself. So in many ways, I want to know the panel thinks about, is stem cells sometimes too early, or various aspects of stem cells? I think the data that you're beginning to see, data that's U.S.-based data, I think it's very exciting. So I hope great hopes. I don't know what the panel thinks.
Who wants to take that one?
I mean, look,
That's the moderators.
I'll quickly jump in, and then I think you're right that there does seem to be a resurgence in gene therapy. You look at what was a very small company, still not a huge company, but a company like a Sarepta that really has done something, I think, fairly transformative and therapeutically very relevant in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy with an exon skipping technology. And there's a company that the valuation obviously has gone up quite significantly in a very short period of time. I think that companies like that, though, and in some ways maybe you can even think of Sarepta not necessarily as gene therapy, maybe it's regenerative medicine, right? To the extent that helping to sustain muscle tissue in these afflicted boys, in a sense, is a regenerative technology. So I think that those sorts of wins, if you will, do reverberate and I think do pass on to companies that are more in the stem cell or regenerative space. They do cycle through.
Great. So I think we're at the end of the time. I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and preparation. Did a great job. And I think they'll be around afterwards as well if you have further questions. So thank you all for showing up as well for the panel.